There is a difference between absence and silence. Absence is what remains when something never was. Silence is what follows when something was removed. You begin with a fragment, a name of a year in a Visigothic ledger, scratched out and written again. The dates do not align. The scribes use terms that never appear elsewhere. The margins are smeared with a soot that does not look like ink. They call it annus obscurus, the dark year. But the Latin is uncertain. There's hesitation in the hand, as though even the act of naming gives it weight. And it begins there, not with fire, not with ruin, but with the failure of the sun to rise. In the year 536, across much of the known world, something changes. The Byzantine chronicler Procopius writes that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. He was not alone. In Syria, the scholar John of Ephesus records a bitter cold that descends in spring and does not lift for 18 months. Crops die where they stand. Famine follows. The Nile fails to flood. But what's strange isn't the event. It's the response. Rome, even fractured, is still literate, still bureaucratic, still devout. Yet most of its record keepers look away. The Codex Justinianus is silent. Ecclesiastical calendars do not mark a crisis. The Annals Regni Francorum skip directly over the strangest summer the empire has ever seen. Where there should be witness, there is stillness. From the ice cores of Greenland, from the tree rings of Lapland, from the dust layer in Irish peat, we know what happened. A sudden and severe drop in global temperatures. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly in the tropics, perhaps Central America or Indonesia. The exact source is debated. The date is not. 536 AD, the beginning of what climatologists now call the late antique Little Ice Age. But this is not a science story. This is a story about forgetting. Because the temperature didn't drop for a day, it fell for a decade. Winters came early and stayed late. Snow fell in August. Frost killed wheat in Egypt. The following year, 537, is colder still. And yet, the chronicles remain largely mute. Why would the church hide the sky? Some historians suggest trauma, that those who lived through it were too broken to write. Others propose logistical collapse, that the scribes had no vellum, no ink, no food. But this was Rome. Even in ruin, it curated its memory. In silence, there is choice. The records that do remain are damaged, physically and conceptually. In one Syriac manuscript, the events of 536 are inserted between verses of lamentation, as though they are biblical punishment. Not history, not real. A Chinese text, the Wei Shu, speaks of yellow dust that obscures the heavens and crops destroyed by cold, yet dates it to a different calendar year entirely. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster refer to a failure of bread. Nothing more. No cause. No sky. No fire. Just the bread. And yet, the pattern is too wide to be coincidence. If this were local, an eclipse, a drought, it would be noted, categorized, explained. But what happened in 536 is global, intercontinental, systemic, and that makes it dangerous. Empires do not survive systemic mystery. They survive stories. So the stories are rewritten, or left unwritten. In a monastery near Ravenna, the scriptorium continues to produce psalters, uncertain, repetitive, near mechanical. The monks are cold. Their robes are thin. There is no record of a famine, but half the names vanish between one register and the next. You can hear the flick of parchment, the dripping wax, the slow, echoing cough of someone dying where no one will write it down. Not far away, the court of Justinian is consumed by theological debates, Monophysite heresy, the exile of Pope Silverius, the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia after the riots. But not the sky, never the sky. One theory, fringe, but persistent, suggests that the eruption of 536 was known, not as a scientific fact, but as an omen, a divine sign. The sky dims. The emperor orders prayer. The bishops declare judgment. A fast is called, but the fast never ends. In this reading, 536 becomes not a year, but a warning, a preface to apocalypse, something to be hidden, lest it returns. We cannot know. No decree survives. No synodal records reference the darkness. But the revisions to church calendars accelerate after this date. New saints are inserted. Old festivals are moved. Easter is recalculated. Time shifts. The silence, then, may not be accidental. It may be liturgical. To acknowledge 536 is to admit a flaw in divine order, a year in which creation itself, the turning of the heavens, failed. That is not heresy. It is worse. It is uncertainty. And so, it becomes unspeakable. You step inside a Benedictine archive, centuries later. The shelves hold copied lives of saints, papal bulls, fragments of Virgil overwritten with psalms. You find a scroll labeled 535 to 540. The wax seal is unbroken. You do not break it. You do not have to, because what you are looking for is not inside. It is in the fact that the scroll was never read. What makes 536 terrifying is not the darkness. It is the consensus. Across Byzantium, Syria, China, Scandinavia, each region records something. A flicker, a shadow, a cold. But Rome, the Rome that survives, that dictates, does not. And if that empire chose to erase the year the sun failed, what else has it removed? The candle flickers in your hand. The parchment curls slightly at the edges, as if resisting. You listen. There is no sound, no birdsong, no scribe, only wind through stone, only the dark. The silence is not uniform. It flakes. On a hillside in central Anatolia, archaeologists find a church that was never finished. The apse stands roofless, the nave uncarved, and the mosaic floor, barely begun, stops mid-pattern. There is no sign of siege, no fire, no repurposing, just abandonment. Beneath its flagstones, a thin layer of gray sediment. Fine-grained, mineral-rich. It should not be there. Tested under microscope, it tells a story the archives would not. Volcanic tephra, consistent with a massive eruption. Its isotopes match a separate find, miles away, buried beneath a monastery vineyard, preserved by centuries of disuse. Both sites dated, independently, to the early 530s. Neither is referenced in any contemporary account, and that's what makes them dangerous. Because the earth does not lie, but it can be ignored. Dust does not behave like soil. It travels, carried on wind, lifted by thermals, suspended for years in the stratosphere. By the time it settles, it has become invisible, part of the sky. But here, under collapsed lintels, in the cracks between collapsed stone, its presence is too deliberate to ignore. There is no local volcano, no known firestorm, no historical fire, just this thin, patient residue. You brush your fingers along the edge of a column drum. The dust is cold, still dry, still capable of movement. Like memory, just before it disappears. Scholars often think of Rome as monolithic, centered, codified, centralized. It was not. By the 6th century, its fragments stretch from the walls of Constantinople to the moors of Britannia. It is not one empire, but overlapping territories, bureaucracies, and liturgies, bound by the illusion of a single heritage. The illusion is useful. That's why it survives. But the truth seeps in at the edges. In Syria, the Bishop John of Ephesus is one of the few to name what happened. His words, in cracked manuscript Syriac. There was a sign in the sky, a darkened sun, and famine came from it. In Constantinople, a chronicler named Theophanes writes of the same period, but not of the sky. Instead, he lists heresies, disputes, theological violence. He does not look up. Elsewhere, the evidence accumulates, but only under the surface. In Ireland, the oak tree stopped growing. In the Alps, pollen records show no spring for nearly 3 years. In Japan, imperial astronomers note a mist that dims the moon, even on clear nights. It is not enough to prove catastrophe, but it is enough to suggest that catastrophe was known and ignored. You walk the corridors of the Vatican secret archives. Beneath vault light and flickering sconce, beneath 25-foot stone ceilings designed to resist fire, flood, and theft, there is a room not listed on any contemporary floor plan. In that room, a reliquary of documents from southern Italy, transferred during the French invasions. Among them, a devotional calendar from Naples. The script is clear, the vellum well preserved. But the sequence is wrong. There is no March 12th, no April 6th, no May 1st. Instead, the page flows from Lent to Pentecost, without naming either. Later hands have added notations, but the original is intact. Who removed the days? Or more precisely, who removed the need to mark them? The philosopher Boethius, writing in the early 500s, says time is the moving image of eternity. A century later, Bede will write that time must be kept, not for its own sake, but for salvation. But between them, between Boethius and Bede, something is broken. The liturgical calendars of Gaul and Spain begin to diverge. The dating of Easter becomes uncertain, and monastic communities from Mount Sinai to the Frankish valleys begin celebrating fixed festivals on movable days. It is not because they forgot. It is because their reference points were shifted, and no one told them why. By now, the theory is emerging that what occurred in 536 was not only environmental, but epistemic. A collapse not just of climate, but of coherence. Imagine a world where each region experiences the sky differently, where Rome is dimmed by haze, but Antioch by famine, where Alexandria prays for light, and the Britons do not even realize it has dimmed. There is no universal language for such a dislocation, so it becomes local, symbolic, or lost. One codex, unearthed from the Library of St. Gall, includes an anonymous homily delivered in mid-century Gaul. It speaks of a punishment that was not a war, a silence that was not peace, a season of twilight that passed through the fields. Some interpret it as allegory, but the timing aligns. What if it is not metaphor? What if it is witness? The Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople is rebuilt by Justinian after the Nika riots. Its vaults gleam with gold tesserae, but the mosaics lack any solar motif. None of the Gospels are depicted in daylight. Some say this is symbolic of Christ's death. Others call it artistic choice, but it stands in contrast to earlier basilicas, where sunrise and light are constant motifs. Something has changed, and perhaps it is not theology. Perhaps it is memory. Ash settles slowly. It coats the high altars. It seeps into codices. It enters lungs and cloisters and unsealed reliquaries. And still, it is not named. But its presence distorts everything. What bread is consecrated under a dark sky? What authority do bishops hold if nature itself refuses to obey? What meaning does empire have when the heavens become ungovernable? You trace the ash layer across a dozen sites. Cappadocia, Corinth, Ravenna, Aquileia, each shows the same stratigraphic ghost. A whisper of catastrophe, too evenly spread to be local. You realize what you're seeing is not just residue. It is denial, stratified. It is the visible echo of what could not be voiced. A final document, a list of tax exemptions granted by Justinian's treasury to provinces deemed inhospitable between 536 and 539. The list is extensive. The exemptions are generous. But the stated cause? Locusts. And the cold. No mention of famine. No mention of sky. The empire pays for suffering, but does not name its origin. And perhaps that is all it needed. When the truth cannot be controlled, it is obscured. With coin, with doctrine, with dust, you step outside the vault. The afternoon sun cuts through a stained glass window. The colors are vivid, red, gold, violet, but the light is weak. It falls flat, like memory recalled under duress. And you wonder, what if this isn't the shadow of an empire? What if it is the empire itself, preserved not through continuity, but through forgetting? Begin not with what we see, but with what we count. Years are the scaffolding of memory. They give shape to power, sequence to faith. Without them, history dissolves into myth. And so when you find that the years no longer agree with each other, when the dates assigned to emperors, to synods, to eclipses begin to blur, you are not witnessing confusion. You are witnessing control. The year is 537, or perhaps 538. The Julian calendar is still in effect, but its guardians, Rome's magistrates, Constantinople's clerics, are uncertain of the day. The months seem to shift. Harvests fail to signal the seasons. The sky yields no reliable sunrises. Time itself begins to misbehave. In desperation, some cities return to lunar reckoning, others to feast day cycles. Others still invent new counting systems altogether, anchored not in observation, but in belief. One text from the monastery at Luxeuil references the 7th Lent since the dimming. There is no further explanation. Which Lent? Which dimming? The date is precise, but the timeline is not. The Annuario Ecclesiastico, preserved in fragment beneath the Vatican Apostolic Library, contains a list of feast days from this period. But the order is wrong. Pentecost precedes Ascension. The Nativity appears twice, once in December, once in March. Scholars blame copyist error, but the same pattern appears in 3 independent copies, and none of them explain why 537 is repeated. Once as a full year, once as a void. In the far north, in the fjords of what is now Norway, the Norse calendar adds a strange detail. A Fimbulvinter, a great winter, lasting 3 seasons. It is mythologized later, in the Poetic Edda, as a prelude to Ragnarok. But the phrasing in earlier rune staves is different. Not destruction, not war. Simply, a winter that ate the sun. Some historians dismiss this as local folklore, unlinked to the Roman timeline. But the tree rings in Lapland say otherwise. 3 consecutive years without growth. 3 winters, with no summer. Just as the Norse claimed. Time is fragile. It does not require apocalypse to break. Only misalignment. If different regions count years differently, and no one corrects them, then chronology becomes a fiction, and fiction becomes law. In the decades after 536, the Eastern Roman Empire issues decrees with erratic timestamps. The Chronic in Pascal, compiled later, attempts to reconstruct them, but admits, in one margin, that some years are unclear in their course. This is not metaphor. The years themselves, their contents, their sequence, are uncertain. We think of time as a river, but here it is a marsh. Still water, no direction, and this is when the adjustments begin. In 525, just before the darkness, a Scythian monk named Dionysius Exiguus proposes a new system. Anno Domini, years counted from the birth of Christ, rather than the founding of Rome. But his calculations are flawed. Most now agree Christ was likely born around 4 BCE, which means year 1 is already wrong. What's less discussed is why Dionysius felt the need to create this system at all. He does not cite theological necessity. He cites confusion. The old systems, he writes, no longer agree. So he makes a new one, not to reflect reality, but to overwrite its fracture. You begin to see the pattern. Volcanic ash, collapsed harvests, missing records, and in response, the invention of time. Time as a weapon, time as a solvent, time as a curtain drawn over what cannot be understood. This is not conspiracy. It is survival. Empires persist not by preserving the truth, but by replacing it, slowly enough that no one remembers the difference. A fringe theory, first proposed by the German historian Heribert Illig in the 1990s, takes this further. He calls it the phantom time hypothesis. It claims that 297 years, between roughly 614 and 911 AD, were fabricated, inserted into the record to align prophecies, to stabilize dynasties, to explain gaps. Mainstream historians reject the theory. Rightly so. The evidence is circumstantial. The motive's unclear. But what if the theory is wrong in its scope, but not in its premise? What if phantom time did not last 297 years? What if it lasted just long enough to pass the crisis? What if the darkness of 536 fractured chronology, and the response was not to repair it, but to disguise the break? We know this much. Between the 530s and 560s, imperial chronicles go dark. Fewer inscriptions are made. Fewer coins are minted with clear dates. Laws continue, but often without timestamps. The 6th century historian Agathias begins his history in 552, refusing to summarize the prior decades. He claims they were well covered by others. But those others are lost, or never written. What happened to the years between? In the East, the Church turns to eschatology. Apocalyptic texts flourish. Visions of the end, of stars falling, of days without light. Not symbolic, not poetic, literal. And yet, by the end of the century, those same texts are deemed uncanonical. Their authors exiled, their visions buried. The Church does not forget. It curates. A fresco in the Sinai Desert, dated roughly to the mid-6th century, shows a strange composition. Christ, haloed, flanked not by apostles, but by 2 veiled figures. Behind them, the sky is black. The stars are absent. The earth is dry. The caption reads, "He stands in the year of silence." The phrase appears nowhere else, but the image is preserved. And so the question lingers. Did they mean it allegorically? Or did they mean 536? The Gregorian calendar reform of 1582 is often viewed as a correction of drift. The Julian calendar, over time, had accumulated too many leap years, misaligning the equinoxes. But some early Jesuits questioned the magnitude of the adjustment. 10 days were removed. The dates jumped from October 4th to October 15th. But certain medieval records hinted at more, at earlier distortions already embedded. A Jesuit astronomer named Christopher Clavius noted anomalies in eclipse records. Some eclipses, dated to the 6th century, did not match observed positions. He dismissed them. Others did not. A letter, and signed, archived in the Vatican's index room, states, "The sun does not deceive, but the scribes do. You trace the anomalies like candlelight on stone. A year that appears twice. A festival that moves without cause. A text that references an emperor no one remembers." You begin to wonder, what is history, if not the agreed-upon sequence of error? And who agreed? In the margins of the Chronographia of Theophanes, a later scribe adds a note. From the dim year, many fell. The rest forgot. And you realize, the forgetting was not passive. It was chosen, not to deceive, but to survive. The bells of a ruined monastery echo in wind. No clocks, no chimes, just hollow bronze. And beneath them, somewhere in the dust, lies a year that does not belong. Not because it never happened, but because it no longer fits. The body keeps its own time. Flesh does not wait for the calendar to adjust. Bones do not forget starvation. Teeth record the absence of sunlight like black box recorders sealed in enamel. And when history forgets itself, when records are burned and dates rearranged, the body remains, testifying in silence. In the ice sheets of Greenland, there is a layer. Dark, acidic, dense with sulfur. It does not appear gradually. It crashes in, like a sealed door flung open. A sudden rupture, dated now to the year 536. Not from fire in Europe, not from battle, but from far away, from the rim of the world. Likely Iceland, possibly Alaska. Some whisper Central America. No one agrees. But what they do agree on is this. The eruption was immense. And it did not come alone. A second follows. Then a third. Each within a few years. Each adding ash to ash, smoke to smoke, silence to silence. Tree rings across the northern hemisphere narrow. Some vanish entirely. Growth ceases. Photosynthesis falters. In Europe, in Asia, in North Africa, famine creeps like shadow down a cold hallway. The years are cold, but more than cold. The light is different. This is the part most often forgotten. Not just darkness, but a strange darkness. Accounts speak of a sun like a blue disk, of no true dawn, of shadows that fall in wrong directions. The Byzantine historian Procopius writes, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." He does not describe fear, only confusion. This was not the end of the world. It was the rupture of a known rhythm. Time without anchor, days without contour. The famines come quietly, not as riots, but as absences. In Egypt, the Nile fails to flood. In China, the Book of Sway records yellow dust that snowed. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster note a failure of bread in 536 and again in 538. Each culture records the failure differently, but each returns to the same thing. The light is wrong. There are human remains in a peat bog in Sweden, dated to the mid-6th century. Male, early 30s, malnourished. Healed fractures along the ribs, suggesting earlier trauma, survived. But what killed him was not violence. It was deficiency, micronutrients, absence of fresh food, immune collapse. A post-mortem sample taken from his femur reveals something strange. Sulfur isotopes, traces of volcanic compounds. In his bones, from eruptions continents away. The volcano didn't reach him, but it changed the sky he lived under. It entered the crops he ate. It slipped into his bloodstream. History often remembers the kings, but it's the bodies that remember the ash. The plague of Justinian begins in 541. It follows the cold years like a shadow follows dusk. The causative agent is Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death centuries later. But this outbreak is earlier, wider, less understood. Some claim it kills 25 million, others 50. The numbers become meaningless because the records are broken. What we know is this. It begins in Pelusium, an Egyptian port, and it climbs the trade routes like smoke in a flue. Constantinople loses tens of thousands in a matter of weeks. The streets overflow. The emperor himself, Justinian, contracts the disease. He survives, But something changes. The laws issued after his recovery are sharper, more rigid, concerned with unity, with loyalty, with order. His codes focus less on what is true and more on what is enforceable. The plague doesn't end in a season. It returns again and again, for decades, each time weaker, each time crueler. We cannot know how much this reshaped the world, because we do not know what the world was before it. Records from the 530s to the 560s are sparse, fragmentary, often secondhand. Some cities vanish entirely, not razed, not burned, just unmentioned. A monastery in Anatolia preserves a single line in Greek. The children of Ash made no tombs. It is a strange phrase. No tombs, no markers, or none left alive to bury. Elsewhere in the Alps, high in the pass of St. Bernard, archaeologists find a Roman road. It cuts through rock with astonishing precision. An imperial project, made for speed, not trade. But the layers of use tell a different story. Suddenly, around the mid-6th century, the traffic stops. No carts, no hooves, no travelers. And then, a trickle returns. Not Romans, but something else. A different kind of footfall. Heavier, slower, less equipped. A change not in culture, but in capability. This is how collapse works. Not with fire, but with forgetfulness. And yet, even now, even with satellite scans and radiocarbon charts and paleoclimatology journals, we still debate what erupted. We still do not know the name of the volcano that rewrote the sky. Iceland, Rabaul, Ilopango. Each theory has merit. Each carries silence. But the truth may be this. We are looking for a single cause. When the system itself had already become unstable, Roman order was never eternal. It was maintained with roads, with taxes, with fear. And when the environment shifted, when the food chain broke, when cities became death traps of heatless stone, the illusion could no longer hold. So people left. Some for the forests, some for monasteries, some for the church, each retreating into smaller systems of survival. What came after was not barbarism. It was recalibration. A slower time, a colder time, a time when the sky no longer followed rules. In the Vatican secret archives, there is a letter written in 544 from a bishop in Ravenna to the Bishop of Rome. He writes of dwindling alms, of dying children, of refugees entering the city with smoke in their hair and dust in their lungs. But he ends with a question. Has the hourglass been broken? Or are we simply counting the wrong way? The letter isn't signed. No response is preserved. But the question persists. What happens when the sun itself becomes unreliable? When the seasons fracture? When emperors die of fever and the soil refuses grain? The answer is not revolution. The answer is something older, quieter, more permanent. You change the way you count, and you bury the rest. The sky clears, eventually. By 550, the sun shines again. The crops begin to grow. The plague fades, for a time. But the world has changed. And in its silence, new powers stir. In a few years, a boy will be born in the Hijaz, destined to carry a flame across the sands of Arabia. In another century, a monk will sit in Lindisfarne and translate the Gospels into a language no Roman would understand. But for now, there is only quiet. The kind that comes after mourning. The kind that follows erasure. The kind that settles. When the ash has finally fallen, the sun rises again. But something is off. It rises too far north. Or perhaps too early. It warms the land, yes, but not the memory. The rhythm is broken. And time, once fluid, becomes mechanical. Measured, regulated, not to understand, but to contain. That's when the counting begins again. But this time with new rules. Historians call it the late antique Little Ice Age. An era of cooling, spanning roughly 536 to 660 CE. But for those who lived inside it, there were no names. No epochs. Just days that failed to become years. Winters that returned too soon. Seasons that betrayed their patterns. Time had always been sacred, marked by feast days, harvests, astral alignments. But now the stars dim. Now the solstice comes with no light. Now the festivals arrive, but the crops are gone. So what do when time itself fractures? You rewrite it. In 525, a Scythian monk named Dionysius Exiguus, Dionysius the Humble, receives a strange commission. He is not a bishop, not a senator, just a quiet man in a Roman cassock, translating Greek canons into Latin from a dim chamber in Rome. But his task is enormous. He is to calculate the date of Easter, not for this year, for all years. He is to anchor the most sacred day in Christendom to the mechanics of celestial time. And to do so, he must make a decision. He must choose where time begins. Until now, Christians used a system called Anno Diocletiani, the years of Diocletian. But Diocletian was a persecutor of the faith, a killer of Christians, a symbol of what the church had survived. So Dionysius rejects it. Instead, he counts forward from what he calls Anno Domini Nostri Jesu Christi, the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. He places the incarnation at year 1. He eliminates year 0. And he begins the Christian reckoning of time, not in empire, but in divinity. It is a small decision, but it changes everything. What he does not know, what no one knows at the time, is that he is dating a ghost. Modern astronomy places the birth of Christ at least 4 years earlier. Some say 6. Herod the Great, who dies in 4 BCE, is still alive at the Nativity in Scripture. The census of Quirinius? Historical, yes, but dated to 6 CE. Something doesn't fit. Multiple strands don't align. But the Church does not correct this. They codify it. In 731, the Venerable Bede takes Dionysius's method and expands it. He is writing Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, a history of the English people, and he chooses Anno Domini as his framework. It spreads through the Frankish kingdom, the Carolingian reforms, and later into the very marrow of Europe's legal and theological thought. Every document, every council, every synod now carries the mark of a ghost year. But something else happens, something quieter. The deeper timekeeping systems, those that came before Christendom, are erased. Lunar calendars, agricultural rhythms, pagan solstices, they are either baptized into Christian meaning or extinguished completely. And so, for the first time, time becomes dogma. And yet, beneath this imposed structure, there are gaps, missing decades, contradictory chronicles, events that seem to repeat, names and wars and reigns mirrored like a palimpsest scraped and rewritten too many times. We call this a timeline, but it is no longer a line. It is a loop, a residue, a mirror. The phantom time hypothesis enters here. Unwelcome, unverified, whispered. First proposed in 1991 by Heribert Illig, a German historian and systems theorist. He argues that nearly 300 years of history, specifically between 614 and 911 CE, were fabricated, inserted, not by forgers or conspirators, but by accident, calendar errors, political motivations, copyist confusion. He claims that the early Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, are artificially inflated, and that we are, perhaps, living not in the 21st century, but in the 18th. It is a fringe theory, rejected by the Academy, but not because it is easily disproven. Rather, because to admit its possibility would unmoor the entire chronology of the West. Illig points to inconsistencies, the lack of reliable archaeology from this period, the repetition of names and titles, the sudden jumps in architectural style, in population, in literacy, and most provocatively, he suggests that the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II conspired to place themselves at the year 1000, to rule at a millennial turning point, to appear chosen. He may be wrong, but the theory persists because the ground beneath it remains unstable. The Julian calendar, used across Europe until the 16th century, was inaccurate. It overestimated the length of the solar year by 11 minutes. By the 1500s, this small error had compounded into a drift of 10 days. Pope Gregory XIII reforms it in 1582. He issues the Inter Gravissimus, erasing 10 days from the calendar. October 4th is followed by October 15th. Protests erupt. Farmers fear for their harvest. Some believe their lives have been shortened. But the Church insists. This is not manipulation. It is correction. The world had slipped. The Church, in its wisdom, has restored it. But what if that was not the first correction? What if it was the second? Or the third? You step into a scriptorium in the Alps. It is winter, 873 CE, or so the monk writes. But the ink is strange, too even. The script is Carolingian minuscule, but it seems learned, not lived. The monk copies from another manuscript. That one copied from yet another. No one in this room has seen Charlemagne. No one remembers the eruption. Only the count of Easter, the cycle of saints, the feast days that must be placed. The monk scratches his pen. He writes the date in the margin. And he moves on. This is not deceit. This is structure. Time must be recorded to be understood. And to be understood, it must be regular. So what happens to a regular time? To years of darkness? To moments when the sun turned blue? They are folded, minimized, forgotten, not out of malice, but because they do not fit. But there is a cost. The loss of memory, the burial of deviation, the rejection of the sky's unreliability. And with that loss, we gain a strange confidence. We believe our calendars are truths, that our years have never been interrupted, that there is no dust in the machinery of chronology. But look closer. Why do Roman ruins sometimes lie beneath medieval towns that never recorded their existence? Why do maps from the 9th century depict cities no longer visible? Why does the same comet appear in manuscripts 200 years apart with identical descriptions? These are not errors. They are echoes. They are the sound of time being folded. There is a cathedral in northern France with a sundial carved into its southern wall. But the dial is wrong. It marks noon when the sun is clearly west. And carved beneath it, in Latin, sol non morator, homo fallator. The sun does not delay. Man is mistaken. Who carved this? Why? The stone offers no answer. Only shadow. We built time to contain the sacred, but we also built it to forget, to standardize, to obscure. And if there are ghosts in the record, years we never lived, or years we should not remember, they will not come screaming. They will arrive like silence, unnoticeable, undeniable. And still, somewhere, the old light lingers. In the dust of archives, in the ink of misdated deeds, in the stories that cannot be placed. The calendar is firm, but the sky has not forgotten. Silence. That is what we are told filled the monasteries. A silence of prayer, of obedience, of stillness. But there is a different kind of silence. The silence of redaction, of removal, of records deliberately left blank. You walk the stone corridor of a Benedictine monastery, Monte Cassino, perhaps, or Corbie, or St. Gall. The air is cold, the walls dense with centuries. Every step echoes across time, not into it, across it. And at the heart of these halls lies not emptiness, but something sharper. The archives, the scriptoria of early medieval Europe were more than places of labor. They were memory machines, not passive, not reactive. They did not merely preserve the past. They curated it. Across the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, just as the climate falters, as harvests fail, as war returns in erratic waves, these quiet cells blaze with ink. Ink that copies, ink that edits, ink that decides what is worth remembering, and what must be left behind. In 774, the Lombards fall to Charlemagne. But only a generation later, monks in Fulda and Tours revise the annals. The war was inevitable, they say. Holy. They smooth the story. They collapse contradictions. The sky had darkened? That is not recorded. The crops failed? That was a test of faith. The sun gave no heat for years? That is metaphor. The chronicler writes, and so the year passed, with peace in the kingdom and the light of God strong among the faithful. But outside the walls, entire villages vanish. Bone-thin children wander from famine-split towns. Entire dialects disappear. Still the record says, peace. Some of the oldest surviving manuscripts from this era are palimpsests, documents scraped and overwritten, liturgical texts written atop classical ones, sermons obscuring forgotten laws. But when examined under ultraviolet light, the layers return. The erasures bleed through. And what they reveal is not chaos, but substitution. Take the Synod of Whitby, 664 CE, a church council in Northumbria where Celtic and Roman Christian traditions collided. We are told it was a peaceful resolution, a theological clarification over the dating of Easter. But letters from the period hint at something else. Exile, disruption, bitterness. A strain not preserved in the main record. Later scribes reframe the synod as harmonious, even holy. It becomes a pattern, tension transformed into unity, fracture overwritten as continuity. But there are cracks in this unity. Some accidental, some deliberate. The Annals Cambrii, Welsh Chronicles, record 2 battles at Mount Badon, centuries apart. Each claimed to be decisive. 2 victories. Same location. No agreed date. And there, wedged between battles, a note. A great mist covered the skies. The crops were taken. The sheep miscarried. No context. No elaboration. The monk simply returns to his sequence of kings and wars, as though the sky had whispered something he could not repeat. Another record, this time from the monastery of Reichenau. A marginal note beside the entry for the year 537. Barely legible. We saw the sun, but it gave no light. A year of dust. The wine spoiled. The scribe underlines it once, faintly, in red. Then continues with the genealogy of bishops. These fragments do not fit the official rhythm, which is why they remain fragments. Their meaning exists not in what they say, but in how they resist the narrative around them. And the deeper you look, the more of them appear. Footnotes that contradict the main text. Marginalia that tells of stars streaking across the sky, not in beauty, but in dread. Short entries marking 2 winters in 1. Notes of children baptized too early. And always the silence after. But not all resistance is subtle. In the late 8th century, a monk in Gaul copies a set of imperial decrees, capitularies, attributed to Charlemagne. But in the margin, he writes, "Why does he call himself emperor, when the empire fell long before?" It is quickly scratched out. Another hand writes over it, "Silence is obedience." That manuscript still exists, the 2 inscriptions still visible. But no one knows the names of either scribe. Monasteries were not neutral. They were the bureaucracies of memory, and they operated under orders. Some issued from abbots, others from bishops, others from Rome itself. Standardize the liturgy, correct the hagiographies, ensure the Easter cycle does not waver, destroy what misleads. And in this process, something terrible happens, not through malice, but through method. History is curated until it becomes myth. The Carolingian Renaissance, so-called, is not a revival. It is a filtration. Manuscripts are copied, yes, but not all. Some are discarded, others rewritten, still others recast to serve the image of a unified Christian past. Gothic texts are ignored. Arabic knowledge is hidden. The old Roman calendars are burned. And time itself becomes a tool, measured not by sky, but by synod, by decree. Even the Book of Kells, so often celebrated for its beauty, holds secrets. Among its ornate illuminations, scholars note a peculiarity. The genealogy of Christ, carefully written, and yet, names are repeated. Joseph appears twice. David is listed in 2 places. And in the margin, a monk's note. There was a miscount. Let no one speak of it. Why? A mistake? Or the residue of a timeline that had already begun to fold? You descend into a monastery cellar. The stone is damp. The air, layered with centuries of breath. In one corner, forgotten beneath crates of sacramental wine, is a bundle of parchment, tied with sinew. You open it. Astronomical calculations, crude but deliberate. A solar eclipse dated to 542. But no such eclipse is listed in modern records. Was it real? Or was it something else entirely? An atmospheric veil, mistaken for cosmic alignment? Either way, it is recorded here, not in the library, but in hiding. And this is the deeper truth. The monasteries were not silent. They whispered. They concealed. They remembered what the world forgot, and then chose what to forget themselves. Not out of cowardice, but out of a terrible, inherited duty. To maintain the story. Because what happens when the story breaks? When the sky contradicts the feast day? When Easter arrives before spring? When darkness falls at noon, and no passage in Scripture matches it? You are a monk. You must answer. You must make it fit, or you must make it vanish. We believe the monasteries preserved knowledge, and they did, but not all knowledge. Some they preserved in silence, in margins, in scratches no one was meant to see. Others they erased, or rewrote, because the role of memory is not always to recall. Sometimes it is to bury, and the soil of the early Middle Ages is heavy with forgotten seeds. A final image, a scribe in a camlet cell, 841 CE. He dips his quill. He writes the date. But outside his cell, the frost has returned. Birds do not sing, and the bells of the monastery ring not for matins, but for mass graves. Still he writes. Still he names the year. He calls it 841. But beneath the parchment, the dust of the sky still lingers. The calendar is our anchor. We believe it holds the centuries in place. We believe it tracks the orbit of Earth, the passage of stars, the return of seasons. we believe it to be truth. But calendars are not truth. They are systems, constructed, adjusted, and, sometimes, corrected to fit a past that no longer made sense. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII issues the papal bull Inter Gravissimus. It is said to be a correction, a fine-tuning of the Julian calendar, which had drifted by 10 days over the course of centuries. A technical fix, we are told, a mathematical update. But the shift is not small. 10 days are removed. October 4th becomes October 15th. And across Catholic Europe, time jumps. The peasantry protest. "What have you done with our days?" they cry. And the officials reply, "They were never yours to begin with." But this is not where the strangeness begins. It begins long before. Back in the 4th century. Back with the Council of Nicaea. Back when Constantine the Great sought to unify the Christian world, not just in doctrine, but in time. The church was divided. Not over faith. Over Easter. Different regions marked the resurrection on different dates, using different equinoxes, different moons, different rules. And that would not do. Time, like Scripture, had to be harmonized. So a decision is made. Easter shall fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. A formula, a pattern, but the pattern does not always fit, because the equinox itself was already slipping. By the early Middle Ages, scholars begin to notice something strange. The stars are no longer where they should be. The feasts arrive early. The solstice drifts. And the calculations, based on a year of 365.25 days, are slowly fracturing. In the year 525, a monk named Dionysius Exiguus recalibrates the dating system entirely. He introduces Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, a new timeline. Jesus, he claims, was born 525 years ago, but his arithmetic is uncertain. Modern scholars agree he was wrong by at least 4 years, perhaps as many as 7, and yet we still measure from his error. Then there is the phantom year. In the 7th century, the Chronicon Paschal, an Easter table, adds a year not found in other sources. Just one, no explanation, and then it disappears in later records. Was it a clerical mistake? A lost leap year? Or something darker? A glitch papered over with doctrine? We do not know, but it remains a scar in the chronology. Time, in the hands of the Church, becomes less a measurement than a narrative device. Chronicles are rearranged, events redated to fit the Passion cycle. Solar eclipses are forced to match Good Friday. Famine is interpreted as punishment, abundance as grace. But the pattern is flawed. Records from Syria, Armenia, and Persia show different timelines, different disasters, sometimes overlapping, sometimes repeating. And the further east you look, the harder it becomes to match the dates. Time stretches, or it folds. In the 9th century, the Byzantine Empire introduces the Byzantine era, a dating system that begins not with Christ, but with creation. The world, they declare, began on September 1st, 5509 BCE. Why that date? No one agrees. Some say it aligns with the Jewish calendar. Others argue it was computed from the Septuagint's genealogies. But even Byzantine scribes express doubt. A margin note in one Psalter reads, "This number has changed in my lifetime. The beginning drifts." And indeed, later records list different starting points, as though the foundation of time were slipping. Centuries pass. And then, in 1583, just a year after Gregory's reform, another voice enters. Joseph Justus Scaliger, a Protestant scholar, a critic of papal time. He introduces a new system, the Julian period, a mathematical construct of 7,980 years. It does not begin at creation, or Christ, or Rome. It begins with nothing. January 1st, 4713 BCE, a hypothetical starting point, chosen for convenience. A 0 point, outside theology, outside memory, a new anchor, but it only underscores the problem. Time is malleable, defined by what we choose to measure, and what we choose to forget. A deeper question arises. What if time itself has been lost? Not miscounted, not misnamed, but erased. Some theorists, often dismissed, suggest that entire centuries may have been inserted or removed, that the so-called Dark Ages are not merely undocumented, but constructed. The phantom time hypothesis, first proposed by Heribert Illig in the 1990s, claims that the years 614 to 911 CE never occurred, that the early Middle Ages were retroactively invented. to fit prophecy, to align calendars, to cement the authority of a church that needed its story to cohere. Mainstream historians reject it, and yet the gaps remain. In architecture, in art, in astronomical data, in the ice cores of Greenland. We should see spikes, volcanic sulfur, cosmic dust, markers of years. But instead, we see silence. White bands, as though someone had frozen the timeline and pressed delete. Even the Gregorian reform was not clean. Countries adopted it in waves. Italy in 1582, Germany in 1700, Britain not until 1752. Russia waits until 1918. By then, the world has fractured into dual timelines. Two calendars, two versions of now, one lagging 11 days behind the other. And across those days, revolutions rise and fall. A czar is murdered, a city burns. But in Rome, it is already tomorrow. You look at a medieval chronicle. The entries are sparse, sometimes poetic. Winter was long. The sea froze. The moon was full but gave no light. Other times, they are precise. On the 11th day of the month, the wind rose. Trees fell. The bells rang. But then a year is missing. No entry. Nothing happened. Or something happened that could not be said. And then another year appears, full of clarity. Too full. Too ordered. As though compensating for absence. You try to reconstruct the timeline. You gather charts, records, feast days, astronomical observations. But the stars don't align. Literally. Eclipses calculated for the 6th century appear centuries too early or too late. Halley's Comet is recorded in 451, then again in 530, then not again until 837. But the math is off. It should appear every 76 years. So where is it in 606? Or 683? Why do the Chinese records show it, but not the European? And when they do match, the dates don't. As though someone shifted the ledger and forgot to realign the sky. The deeper you go, the less stable the timeline becomes. The reigns of kings overlap. Popes are duplicated. Feast days contradict lunar cycles. Even the Passion of Christ, so central, so fixed, is dated anywhere from 30 to 36 CE. 6 years. 6 missing years. And yet every calculation depends on it. The fulcrum of faith. Pivoting on a date we cannot confirm. A scholar once said, "The calendar is not a clock. It is a mirror. It shows us what we wish time had been. And perhaps that is all we've ever had. Not a chronology, but a curated reflection. The real time, marked by dust, hunger, sky-darkening ash, remains buried. Compressed between councils and crusades. Filtered through liturgies. Smoothed into doctrine. The records are clean. Too clean. You look again at the dates carved above a cathedral door. Built in 1120, it says. But the stone beneath it has eroded beyond recognition. Was it really 1120? Or was that when they rewrote its name? In the Vatican Secret Archives, there is a document marked Non Tempus. No date, just the title. Its contents remain classified. No one can say why. But if the calendar has ever been a lie, that is where the truth might wait. Not in numbers, but in what numbers have tried to hide. The calendar never fit. It was hammered into shape. Chiseled, burnished, forced to conform to a story that needed to be told in order. But the world was not made in order. It was made in ash and dark and silence. And we only pretended it was otherwise. The atmosphere is a memory. It remembers what we do not. Volcanoes speak through it. Comets inscribe across it. The sun retreats from it when the balance breaks. And above all else, it holds the dust. Invisible to the naked eye, but layered, year upon year, into ice, into soil, into the deep lungs of the earth. Dust is not poetic here. It is forensic. And when something catastrophic occurs, the dust tells the truth, or at least what remains of it. In the 1980s, glaciologists begin to core the Greenland ice sheet. They drill deep, thousands of meters, back through millennia. Each layer is a season. Each band a breath of ancient air. And then they see it. A sharp line of sulfur. Blackened, heavy, unnatural. Dated roughly to the year 536 CE. Followed by more in 540. Then again in 547. 3 pulses. 3 intrusions. Not local events. Global. Something massive had broken the sky. Historians, when they learn of this, are not surprised. Because they have already seen it. In the texts. In the tremble of the records. In the year 536, Procopius writes of a sun that gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. In Ireland, scribes record a failure of bread that lasts for years. In China, snow falls in August. Crops fail. The emperor's astrologers grow silent. In Constantinople, the sea freezes in the harbor. And yet for centuries, no one connected these events. They were scattered, separated by distance, language, fear. But the ice connects them. The dust reveals their unity. Something, perhaps a volcano, perhaps more, had reached into the upper atmosphere and veiled the world. It becomes known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, roughly 536 to 660 CE, a period of abnormal cold, famine, and collapse. But the cause remains speculative. Where was the eruption? Iceland? North America? The tropics? For decades, the answer shifts. Some suggest Rabaul, others blame Ilopango. But Ilopango's eruption may be too early, circa 431. Others point to the far north, Katla, or the elusive Vanuatu. There is no consensus, because the dust doesn't speak names. It speaks only composition. And the signatures are scrambled. Multiple sources, multiple shadows. Then there is the question no one wants to ask. What if it wasn't just volcanoes? Because something else is missing. Trees. In dendrochronological records, the careful study of tree rings, growth all but stops in 536. The rings are narrow, weak, stressed. Photosynthesis collapsed. But it's not only trees. Plankton die. Coral shows bleaching. Atmospheric carbon drops. The entire system weakens. That implies more than local climate change. It implies a filter, a veil. In 2004, researchers propose a new theory. What if an asteroid or comet entered the upper atmosphere? What if it exploded before impact, like Tunguska, but on a planetary scale? It would leave minimal crater evidence, but the debris field would be enormous. High-altitude particulates, microscopic glass, sulfates, just enough to poison the light for years. A dry fog, some chroniclers called it, lingering, diffuse, immune to rain, and the sun behind it, pale, static, useless. You walk through the timeline. 536, the sun dims. Crops fail. Panic begins. 540, another spike in sulfur. Possibly a second eruption, or a continuation. 541, the plague of Justinian begins. It moves fast, too fast. Byzantium reels. Entire villages empty. The dead outnumber the living. And yet, curiously, the disease spreads along routes that no longer function, roads buried in ash, ports frozen. It's as if the mechanisms of trade persist long after they should have failed. That might mean one of two things. Either the infrastructure was more resilient than we thought, or the timeline is still wrong. In Japan, there is a record from 540. The sun is faint. We do not know the seasons. The sky glows red at night. In Mesopotamia, a foul wind comes from the north. Birds fall from the sky. The stars tremble. In Mesoamerica, carved into a stele, year of ash, year without maize. The gods blindfolded the world. They had no word for a volcano from the other side of the globe. Only metaphor, only dread. Modern modeling shows that a large enough eruption or atmospheric impact could drop global temperatures by up to 3 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like much, but it is the difference between wheat and nothing, between migration and collapse, and crucially, between record and silence. Because when famine comes, people do not write. They eat the parchment, they burn the books, and the scribe dies with the text half finished. In Armenia, a manuscript pauses mid-sentence in 547. No explanation, just a blot of ink. Then nothing. It resumes, on a different page, in a different hand, 10 years later. The style is colder, less ornate. There is no mention of what happened, only a strange line in the margin. And for a time, the voice was gone. The Greenland cores show a return to relative clarity around 660, but the pattern has changed. Seasons arrive late. Storms increase. The sky remains slightly dimmer. A new normal. And history marches on, as though nothing happened. Empires reform. New calendars appear. Wars resume. But beneath it all, the climate hums in a minor key. Still off. Still remembering. Even today, some satellites detect unusual reflectivity in high-altitude aerosols, residues from centuries ago. Not active dust, but settled fingerprints. whispers of opacity, as if the sky, too, has not fully healed. There are theories, always. Some speak of a chain reaction, one volcano triggering another. Others suspect solar minima, reduced radiation compounding the effect. A few look further outward still. Comet Enki. It passes close every few years. Some believe its tail shed fragments that may have struck Earth's atmosphere in 536. No impact needed, just intrusion. A celestial smear across the upper veil. But we cannot know, because the sky keeps no index. Only echoes. You try to reconcile it. All the pieces. The ice cores. The tree rings. The lost entries. The sudden silences. And always, the dust. It coats everything. Not thick, not visible, but persistent. In every library, every archive, every untouched reliquary. The dust at the edges of time. Uncatalogued. Undisturbed. Waiting. There is a chapel in Sicily, built in the late 6th century. The frescoes are faded. The light enters weakly. But along one curved wall is a painted archangel, holding a book. The book is closed. And on the cover, in Latin, Tenier umbra. I am held by shadow. There is no record of the artist. No known patron. Only this figure, standing against a red sky. Eyes wide, mouth sealed. And in the dust at his feet, fragments of volcanic glass. So much of our history survives in stone and word. But here, in the era of the dimmed sun, we must look elsewhere. To the elements themselves. To the compounds that settled in layers no one meant to preserve. To the atmosphere, our last honest archive. It does not cure it. It does not forget. But it also does not explain. And maybe that's the truest shape of time. A pressure front. A glass sky. A year that never fully returned. Something shifts now. Not in the earth or the atmosphere, but in time itself. The records we followed, those half-erased parchments, those atmospheric scars, begin to ripple. They no longer hold steady. And it becomes clear. The disaster may not only have darkened the sky. It may have broken the calendar. You stand before two stones. One, from Ravenna, dated Anno Domini 536. The other, a Byzantine artifact, bearing a year you cannot place. 6048, by the reckoning of Constantinople. Same event, same century, different chronologies. The further you look, the stranger it becomes. The Julian calendar, the Alexandrian calendar, the Armenian calendar, the Diocletian era, the Byzantine world era. Each tells a different story, not because time passed differently, but because someone decided it should appear so. Not all calendars are innocent. Some are wounds. Begin with the Julian system, named after Julius Caesar, imposed in 45 BCE. It was a reform meant to standardize time across the empire. It added leap years, adjusted solstices, rationalized the unruly chaos of lunar cycles. But it wasn't perfect. By the time of Caesar's death, even his own calendar was drifting. By the 6th century CE, solstices were off by several days. Religious festivals misaligned. Harvests miscounted. But no corrections were made. Why? Because to correct time is to admit it is wrong. And wrong time means wrong history. Then there's the Byzantine era, used from the 7th to the 15th century. Its year one is not Christ's birth, but the supposed date of creation, 5509 BCE. They believed they could trace the world to its origin. But the further back you look in this reckoning, the more it breaks. Events appear to happen twice. Others vanish entirely. Wars with no cause. Famines with no preceding drought. Plagues emerging from nowhere. As if a bridge had collapsed, and a different one quietly built in its place. You look to Bede, writing in Northumbria in the 8th century. He tries to reconcile time. His ecclesiastical history is filled with cross-references. Solar eclipses, lunar cycles, annals and baptisms. But even Bede admits confusion. At one point he writes, "Some say it is the year 731. Others, 735. The stars cannot agree. And stars don't lie. But when they do not match the records are altered." A strange figure emerges here, Dionysius Exiguus, a monk from Scythia, a scholar of Easter tables. It is he who proposes the Anno Domini system, dating years from the birth of Christ. He invents it not to reframe time, but to bring unity to the church's scattered feasts. But his math is wrong. He places Christ's birth at 753 AUC, ob urb condita, from the founding of Rome. Modern scholars believe Christ was born years earlier, perhaps in 4 BCE. Dionysius miscalculates, and no one corrects him, because his error becomes doctrine. And once doctrine settles, time itself must obey. That might explain the silence, but it does not explain the absences. Why, in some chronologies, is the year 614 missing? Why do certain Armenian records skip directly from 537 to 540? Why does the Chronic in Pascal, in its 7th century form, compress entire decades into single paragraphs? And why, in the Vatican secret archives, are there manuscripts with pages scraped blank between these very dates? The ink has been removed, the parchment preserved. That is not accident. It is curation. In the 16th century, Pope Gregory XIII attempts to solve the problem. The Julian calendar has now drifted nearly 10 days. So he introduces the Gregorian reform. In 1582, 10 days are removed. October 4th is followed directly by October 15th. But not everyone accepts it. England refuses until 1752. Russia waits until 1918. This reveals something critical. Time is not universal. It is negotiated. And when time is negotiated, it can be manipulated, even erased. Which brings us to the phantom time theory, a fringe idea, dismissed by most, but it clings to the edges of scholarly conversation. Proposed in the 1990s by Heribert Illig, it claims that nearly 300 years of history, between 614 and 911 CE, were fabricated, that the early Middle Ages were an invention, that Charlemagne did not exist, that documents were backdated, that time itself was artificially extended. The theory is not accepted, but the questions it raises are valid, because there are gaps. Artifacts dated to the Phantom period lack stratigraphic depth. Construction techniques remain static. Coinage does not evolve. Languages show minimal shift, as if history paused or was written retroactively. And yet, if that's true, what does it mean for the volcanic winter? Did it happen in 536 or 836? Is the entire crisis displaced? Or are we chasing shadows cast from behind a false veil? Historians reject the idea. Too radical, too unverifiable. And yet, fragments persist. In Bavarian monasteries, an 8th century script is overwritten by a 10th century hand, claiming to be earlier. In Irish annals, dates are duplicated. In Carolingian texts, the sun darkening is described, but out of sequence. There is a rhythm to the errors, like echoes from an original event, retold in shifting keys. This leads us to Easter. It may seem trivial, but Easter controls everything. It determines planting, pilgrimage, penance, and taxation. To miscalculate it is to misalign society. The Council of Nicaea, 325 CE, attempted to standardize it, but different regions used different equinoxes. Some followed lunar reckoning, others solar. Errors compounded, and once again, Dionysius appears, his tables adopted to simplify Easter's calculation. But his tables are flawed. They repeat after 532 years, an artificial harmony. Some now wonder, were those tables designed to overwrite earlier cycles? A way to force time back into line. And in doing so, what had to be erased? The sky helps. In 536, the sun dimmed. But when? Records vary by region. Some say March, others September. The Byzantine Chronicle of Theophanes places the event across multiple years. But Theophanes was writing in the 9th century, 300 years later. He cites older sources, but many are lost, burned, stolen, or revised. And then, there's the silence. From 550 to 600 CE, papal records are thin. No decrees, no bulls, few letters. In the East, the court chronicles of Persia also fade. In China, the Book of Sui contains anomalies, rulers whose reigns are repeated, battles copied. It's not fabrication, it's reconstruction. Someone tried to rebuild the past. But like poor masonry, the joints show. The same phrasing, the same metaphors, the same dust on every page. What if time broke? Not metaphorically, but administratively. The volcanic winter disorients entire regions. Famine destroys scribes. Plague ends dynasties. In the aftermath, records must be rebuilt. Monks attempt to reconcile Easter tables. Courts forge lineage. Churches synchronize calendars. And somewhere in that effort, deliberate or not, years are misplaced. Not hidden, not deleted, but moved. like a drawer shuffled back into the wrong cabinet. We rely on text, but text decays, ink fades, scribes die, and when the text fails, we fall back on assumption. Chronology becomes tradition. Tradition becomes law. Law calcifies into fact. And yet, somewhere beneath the marble floor of a forgotten abbey, in the stone foundation beneath a misdated church, in the pollen layers of a peat bog that refuses to lie, there is a different time, buried, uncorrected, still waiting. You sit in the library of St. Gall. Midwinter light filters through the glass. Shelves stretch above you like ribs. The silence here is curated, like an exhibit no one wants you to find. You open a codex. The date inside reads 541, but the script matches one known only from 700. The parchment has been reused. There is a page beneath the page. You hold it to the light, and in ghosted ink, backwards, faded, almost gone. Tempus perditum est. Time has been lost. And then a symbol, a spiral, drawn once, scratched out, drawn again. You do not know its meaning, but you know its echo. You've seen it before. On a fresco in Sicily, on the casing of an ancient astrolabe, on a coin misdated by a century. The spiral spins, and time does not hold. Not anymore. The years that follow the volcanic winter are not bright. They are not structured. They are not fully remembered. The sky recovers, but the mind does not. It is here we enter the true dark, not a nightfall of stars or shadows, but a darkness of memory, of record, of light that never arrived. This is not metaphor. This is the collapse of attention. Step now into the 540s. The great empires have not fallen, but they have stopped writing. In Constantinople, Justinian rules with the weight of divine favor, but his court records fall strangely quiet. Procopius, his official historian, writes of wars and buildings, but not the sky. Only in his secret anecdota, the secret history, does the world distort. He speaks of plague, of demonic politics, of an empress whose power terrifies even God. He writes as if truth has gone underground. And yet, even he does not mention the ash. Not directly. Why? What was too dangerous to say? Elsewhere, scribes disappear. In Britain, the 540s mark the end of one set of hands in the Welsh annals, and the beginning of a different ink, different grammar. In Gaul, Gregory of Tours notes the sun's dimming, but passes it off as divine punishment. In China, official astronomers observe anomalies, faint suns, crimson skies, but the court censors delay their publication. And in India, Gupta records taper into silence, not because nothing happens, but because memory no longer has witnesses. But the Earth continues. Ice cores in Antarctica hold layers from this time, strata of black glass, of sulfuric ash, of disrupted carbon. Tree rings grow narrow, dense, tight with cold. Caves fill with calcite layers that show chemical drift, less sunlight, more monsoon. The climate records are clear, but climate is not history. History needs human eyes, and human eyes were not watching, or were turned away. You trace the decline in mosaic. In Ravenna, golden tiles once shimmered under candlelight. The Basilica of San Vitale, the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, they still stand, but something changes. In works dated after 540, the gold fades. The figures flatten. Faces once rendered in exquisite gradation become abstract, iconic, vacant. It is not only an artistic shift, it is a change in perception, as if vision itself had narrowed, as if the world was no longer safe to depict. In Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum enters silence. Once a thriving empire, minting coins, building stele, commanding trade across the Red Sea, Aksum's record stops abruptly in the mid-6th century. Archaeology shows burned layers, disrupted port structures, collapsed irrigation. No written explanation survives. Just a blank stretch, no longer empire, not yet memory. This era becomes known, in some circles, as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. From roughly 536 to 660 CE, the climate cools sharply. Not a freeze, not everywhere, but enough to stunt crops, displace tribes, provoke war, halt migration. The Avars move west. The Lombards press into Italy. The Slavs descend from the north. Empires respond with walls, but walls do not feed the hungry. And hunger breaks boundaries faster than swords. In the east, a second volcano erupts. Ilopango, modern-day El Salvador. Radiocarbon dating places the event around 539 to 540 CE. Its blast is massive, one of the largest in the Holocene, but the Western world does not record it. They had no maps of that land, no knowledge of that fire. But the sky dimmed again, and the world, already wounded, sank deeper. Famine becomes permanent. In Ireland, annals note a failure of bread. In China, locusts swarm far from their natural zone. In the Levant, ancient irrigation systems go untended. Cisterns fill with dust instead of rain, others by war. But either way, it is never repaired. Entire regions are abandoned. The world is not ending, but its shape is shifting beyond recognition. And then the plague arrives. Justinian's plague, first appearing in 541 in Pelusium, an Egyptian port, then Alexandria, then Constantinople. Within months, the Eastern Roman Empire collapses inward. Not politically, not entirely, but spiritually. Procopius writes of 10,000 deaths per day in the capital, of corpses stacked in palaces, of the emperor himself struck down and barely recovering. The plague recurs in waves for over 2 centuries. Each resurgence carries a different strain. Some die within hours. Others hallucinate, convulse, turn cold while still alive. Cities empty. Villages vanish. Even language changes. Words for death multiply. Words for hope recede. And yet, the church grows. This is one of the strangest patterns of all. As empires fragment, the church consolidates. Councils are held, not always documented, but decisive. By the late 6th century, Rome reasserts primacy. Missionaries spread west. Benedictine rule emerges. The monastic system, solitary, self-contained, resilient, thrives in collapse. The monks copy texts, but they do not copy all. Some codices are deemed unworthy, heretical. Others are simply lost. Still others are hidden, buried in jars, sealed in wall cavities, erased and overwritten. The silence is not total, but it is chosen. In this gloom, something strange begins to take shape. It is not a civilization, not yet, but a scaffolding. Charlemagne will rise 2 centuries later. His scribes will seek to reconstruct Rome, but their Rome is imagined, a compilation of fragments. They will invent titles, retrofit lineages, forge a Christian Caesar. Even the term Holy Roman Empire is an anachronism, a label from after the fact, applied to justify the present. The light returns, but it casts no clear shadow, just reflections of things that may never have been. And beneath it all, something resists. You find it in the marginalia, notes scribbled in the corners of missals, stars beside passages of Revelation, little spirals, again, sometimes drawn in red ink, sometimes burned into the parchment with hot iron. A code, a warning, or a kind of refusal. They are not part of the text, but they are part of the story, and they echo across regions. From Sinai to Gaul, from Armenia to Britain, the same spiral, over and over, as if someone is trying to remember something no longer permitted to be known. In the Alps, a cave monastery is sealed. No name, no date, just silence and stone. Inside, when opened centuries later, a shelf of preserved scrolls, all written between 535 and 560. Each ends with the same final line. Veritas dormivit. Truth has slept, and nothing more. You wonder, who closed the record? Was it neglect, illness, or instruction? Was there an order to halt, to redact, to rewrite? Some believe the Eastern Church, in the chaos of Constantinople's collapse, sought to simplify time. Others point to Rome, to Gregory the Great, who ascended in 590, a pope during plague. He restructured liturgy, reformed the chant, but his letters, though preserved, never mention the darkest days. He speaks of sin, of penance, but not of ash, not of sunless years, not of the spiral. And if that's true, if even those who saw it chose not to remember, then what remains? Only this: the world changed. In stone, in breath, in hunger, in loss. And the records, the surviving records, are built atop silence. They are reconstructions, palimpsests, echoes of days no longer counted. And if light does not return, if it never fully did, then perhaps we are still living in that age. Not past it, but shaped by it. Ghost-written by an era that swallowed its own name. The calendar is supposed to hold, supposed to remain fixed, sacred, immune to disruption. But what happens when the sky forgets itself? When sunrises no longer arrive on time? When equinoxes shift without permission? This section begins with a single contradiction: quiet, buried, nearly missed. The Easter tables no longer align. Easter, the hinge of liturgical time, depends on light. Specifically, the first Sunday after the first full moon following the vernal equinox. But in the years after 536, the moon is obscured. The sky burns dim red. Phases are unreliable. Equinoxes come early, or late, or not at all, and suddenly the church faces a dilemma. Without sky, there is no calendar. And without calendar, there is no Christ. You may think this would lead to reform, correction, consensus, but it does not. Instead, it leads to silence. And then, divergence. Different churches begin celebrating Easter on different days, some by moon, some by tables, some by authority. This is not an academic dispute. It is a wound in time, an institutional fracture disguised as doctrine, and it will take centuries to heal, if it ever does. In the shadows of this calendrical confusion, something darker brews. A hidden movement. It does not name itself. It is not found in synods, or papal bulls, or conciliar decrees. But you see its fingerprints and pattern, where dates are erased, where margins are scraped, where chronicles in midline. Across Europe, monks redact annals, some blame scribal error, others suggest obedience. The worst offenders are not the gaps, they are the forgeries. Forged history is not a modern crime. It begins here, in the 6th and 7th centuries, where memory falters, power rights. Documents appear with retroactive dates. Charters claim lands granted by kings long dead. Hagiographies assign miracles to saints whose bones were never found. And most damning, entire centuries are telescoped, collapsed inward like burned parchment. Between 614 and 911, something strange occurs. Not absence, but compression. This is the argument of a few, not many. A handful of scholars, writing centuries later. They call it the phantom time hypothesis. The claim that up to 300 years of history, between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, were artificially inserted into the calendar. That the year 614 was followed not by 615, but by 911. That Charlemagne, the great unifier, never existed. Or rather, that he existed, but centuries later, under a different name. The evidence is circumstantial. Calendrical inconsistencies, astronomical misalignments, coinage that doesn't match reigns, architecture ahead of its time. But most disturbing, the silence. Too many decades with too few documents, too few bodies, too few stars. Most historians reject this. They point to Byzantine sources, to Islamic chronicles, to astronomical records from China, India, the Americas. They say, the time is real, but even they acknowledge the anomaly. They call it the early medieval period, the Dark Ages. But why dark? Was it ignorance? Or something else? Consider the Anno Domini system, proposed by Dionysius Exiguus in 525 to replace Diocletian years with Christ-centered time. But his chronology is off. Modern scholars place the birth of Christ somewhere between 4 and 6 BCE, and no year zero exists. Why? Dionysius never explains. He calls it divine order, but he begins with absence, a missing center, and a new axis. The result? Time is recentered, but not recalculated. The Church adopts Anno Domini slowly, but by the 8th century, it dominates. A world reordered around a date that never happened. Others lose it. Events are repositioned, synods retrodated, martyrdoms reclassified. 1,000 local calendars are extinguished, and a singular version imposed. A calendar not of stars, but of control. Meanwhile, lunar anomalies continue. Eclipses recorded out of season. Auroras observed in the tropics. Some scholars suggest solar minima, periods of decreased solar activity. The Maunder minimum, the Sporer minimum. But these terms come later. In the moment, there are only omens, fear, and sky that does not behave. And still the plague returns, reappearing every few decades. Its route is fractal, not linear, but recursive. It follows trade, then retreats. Appears in monasteries, then in ports. Ships carry it. So do coins. So do prayers. Each wave resets memory. The living fear the past. The past forgets the living. In monasteries, a strange practice emerges, damnatio memoriae. The the condemnation of memory. Certain names are blotted out. Not enemies, saints, kings, clerics. Their deeds remain, but their identities are stripped, as if someone feared being remembered too clearly, as if survival required forgetting. You see this in vellum reused, in tombstones turned inward, in birth records with holes. At Fulda, a monk records a year with no Easter, none that could be calculated. He calls it Anna Sine Lumen, year without light. The term does not appear again, but echoes of it remain. In Welsh, Blwyddyn heb hall, year without sun. In Armenian, Tari Shari, the ruined year. These are not metaphors. They are coordinates. In the East, the Byzantine Empire clings to chronology. But even there, something slips. In 691, the Quinisext Council convenes. Its canons number over 100, but they reference laws from centuries before, laws whose texts no longer exist. And the dating? In Inditians, a 15-year cycle used to obscure the year of Christ. When calendars wobble, power speaks in riddles. And then the clocks. Yes, the mechanical clock comes later. But before it, there were water clocks, astrolabes, nocturnals. In 7th century Persia, a scholar describes a clock that no longer works. He writes, "The heavens do not obey their own design." Is it metaphor? Or an attempt to record what cannot be recorded? A horizon that has shifted? A future that has already occurred? If time is a construct, then who constructs it? Monks? Kings? Skywatchers? Or something larger? Something that requires order at all costs? You begin to wonder, what is being hidden? A century? A war? Or a shift in consciousness? Is the missing time a symptom? Or the disease? And if the records were sealed to protect truth? What if truth was never real to begin with? Beneath a church in Ravenna, restorers find a fresco sealed behind plaster. It shows the usual scene: Christ, lambs, apostles. But behind them, barely visible, a spiral in the sky, painted in gold leaf. Just once, never repeated. The fresco is dated 547, a year after the plague, a year into the dark. The plaster was applied shortly after. A seal, a silence, a horizon closed. And still the question lingers. If the calendar is wrong, if the past is rearranged, then what do we call now? Is this the 21st century? Or something else? What year is it really? And who gets to decide? Time is not buried in books. Not only, it's buried in stones, in mortar and ruin, in the weight of granite steps and the arc of forgotten vaults. You walk through a monastery, maybe in Ireland, maybe in the Pyrenees, and feel it. The cold geometry of something left unfinished. Walls that end abruptly, naves without transepts, foundations misaligned to the stars. The ground tells a different story, a timeline too short, or too long, or simply not true. Some of the most enduring structures of post-Roman Europe are incomplete, not collapsed, not abandoned, begun and then paused. Stone quarries opened, then sealed. Workshops set up, then dismantled. Frescoes sketched, but never painted. 1,000-year silence in limestone. One theory suggests plague interrupted the building. Another, that climate shifted labor northward. But none explain the chronology. Why are some Carolingian chapels more Roman than Roman ruins? Why do arches in the 9th century match forms from the 3rd? There are fragments that do not fit, and others that fit too well. Architectural anachronism is not a mystery in itself. Styles persist. Masons repeat. But these repetitions feel less like survival and more like mimicry. Reverse echoes, as if someone was trying to recreate a world they could no longer remember, and doing so with fragments, drawings, oral tradition, the memory of ruins. In Aachen, Charlemagne's chapel borrows the octagon from Ravenna, but Ravenna's dome draws on Constantinople. And the model for Constantinople? It is lost. The copy becomes the source, and the origin dissolves. In southern France, a church is found with 2 apses, one pointing east, one, strangely, southwest. No inscription explains this. The floor is perfectly symmetrical, yet neither apse appears original. Beneath it, earlier foundations, burned, carbon dated to the mid-500s. And yet above them, stones shaped by tools not in use until the 9th century. A structure born across centuries, like someone building across time itself. This is where archaeology begins to tremble. It depends on layers, strata, context, but volcanic winters compress those layers. Ash buries fast, Seals hold decades under single events. Floods erase years of accumulation. Plague halts deposition. And then comes reuse. Bricks are taken from temples. Capitals from forgotten shrines. You cannot trust sequence. Time no longer runs straight. It loops, cracks, repeats. Beneath Canterbury, there is a mosaic older than the cathedral. It shows a phoenix, rising, not from flame, but from shadow. The Latin reads, Resurgam ex umbra, I will rise from the shade. There is no known liturgy for this image. No matching him. No record of it in any known rite. The closest parallel is from Egypt. From a temple lost beneath sand before Rome fell. How did the design arrive? Trade? Or memory? Or something else? Something that survived where history did not? Some structures speak more clearly in their absence. A cloister where no monks were buried. A keep without records of siege or ownership. An aqueduct leading to nothing. These are not ruins of conflict. They are artifacts of erasure. Built, not broken. And then forgotten. But not by time. By choice. The silence is too clean. In the Alps, a manuscript is discovered under a church floor. Wrapped in waxed linen. Its script is Merovingian, but the language is older, pre-Carolingian Latin. It describes a time when the sun did not climb beyond the shoulder of the sky, when crops refused the calendar, when the old order of the stars turned upon itself. It speaks of the 3 winters, not as season, but as curse. It does not mention Christ, but it does mention a king with no name, a shadow ruler, seen only in eclipse. The manuscript ends mid-sentence. The ink fades to nothing. No one knows who buried it. No one ever claims it. There are patterns here. Anomalies not in fact, but in feeling. You begin to see the same measurements repeated. 111 feet, 365 steps, 12 columns. Numerical symmetries that suggest cosmology, not utility. Churches oriented to the sun, but not to today's sun. To solstices that now occur days later. To stars that no longer rise where they should. Precession cannot account for all of it. Some orientations are simply wrong. Or perhaps they were right once. Before the axis changed. Before the skies forgot their place. And there's something else. Stone graffiti. Found in dozens of sites from Ireland to Armenia. Not language. Not runes. But circles within circles. Concentric spirals. Always 3. Always carved low, near the floor, or high in dark corners. Places where the light fails. Their purpose is unknown. Some suggest they are apotropaic, meant to ward off. Others say mnemonic. But a few scholars call them chronomarks. Time signs. As if someone tried to pin the moment down. To etch it into the wall itself. So it could not be stolen again. In Skellig Michael, the monastery perched above the Atlantic, a cell is found with no door. No window. Just a hollow. Stone stacked with obsessive care. Inside, a smooth slab. Not an altar, but a seat. Facing west, toward the sunset, or what once was sunset. No inscription, just a single carving above the entrance. A flame, flickering, drawn in a style never seen again. The cell is never mentioned in records, but the stone remembers. When architecture loses purpose, it becomes myth. And myth fills the gaps left by time. In Bavaria, there are stories of churches that appeared overnight. Of bells heard ringing in forests with no towers. Of foundations uncovered in fog, then gone by morning. Legends, yes, but always with detail. Dates that don't fit. Clergy with impossible names. Masses conducted under eclipsed moons. The silence of the stones is not quiet. It is deliberate, constructed. A stillness so vast it becomes a language. The architects knew, or suspected, they built for something beyond doctrine, beyond season. A kind of permanence that time itself could not steal. And yet even they failed. Because permanence is a myth. The stones forget, too. Given long enough, everything forgets. In Cordoba, a mosque becomes a cathedral. In Rome, a basilica overlays a mithraeum. In Istanbul, a church becomes a mosque, becomes a museum, becomes a silence. Each layer writes over the last. Each builder buries a truth. Each altar forgets the God that came before. And so time becomes sediment. Not history, but geology. Compressed under faith and fear. Some believe this is the real reason the calendar was reformed. Not to correct, but to bury, to smooth the cracks in the clock, to silence the stones that spoke too clearly. Pope Gregory XII's bull in 1582 erased 10 days from the calendar. But what else did it erase? What cracks lay hidden beneath those days? And what truths, if unearthed, would shatter the hourglass altogether? You sit in a chapel now, stone, cold, echoing. Light from a slit window falls across the floor. It touches nothing, just a shadow of where the altar once stood. There is dust, yes, but also something beneath the dust. A line, a mark, a carving, maybe, but worn, almost erased. And beside it, faint but real, 3 circles. You close your eyes, and in that silence, you hear the question: how much of our past is reconstruction? How much was ever known? And how much was built, not to remember, but to forget? There's a map in your hands, hand-copied, frayed at the edges. It shows rivers that no longer exist, mountain ranges drawn in the wrong place, cities built before they were born. And yet, the names are familiar. Rome, Antioch, Ravenna, Trier, each one precisely inked, each one slightly misplaced. You stare at it long enough and something inside you begins to tilt. Not just the map, but time itself. Because if this was drawn in the 6th century, how did it chart a world that wouldn't appear until the 9th? And if it was drawn in the 9th, why does the coastline match satellite imagery? The misalignment isn't just spatial, it's chronological. The world mapped before it existed, or remembered before it returned. In a Benedictine scriptorium, a monk begins copying a calendar of saints. The year is 741, or so the margin says, but the feast days don't match. Some names are too new, others too old. He scratches his head, pauses, starts again. We have the manuscript still. The ink is layered, early brown iron gall, then darker overmarks, then an erasure. Not erased with blade or acid, erased by instruction, erased by decree, overwritten by a newer hand. Underneath, a saint no one remembers. Above, one canonized 3 centuries later. When time fractures, it doesn't shatter. It warps, ripples, and in those ripples, anomalies surface. Liturgies for events that haven't happened yet. Coinage minted for kings not yet born. Solar eclipses recorded centuries too early. These aren't fantasies. They are archived. In the Vatican Library, an 11th century copy of Bedes de Temporibus contains a marginal note. The sun darkened for half a year in the time of Justinian, but no one knows in what year he ruled. A misplacement, or a memory too large to fit. You begin to see these cracks everywhere. Take Dionysius Exiguus, the monk who calculated the Anno Domini system. His dating begins with Christ's birth, but his 0 point isn't 0. Modern scholars agree. His chronology miscalculates Herod's reign by at least 4 years. And yet his system becomes law. The calendar reforms follow it. The world counts from a misaligned origin. Why? Because even errors become sacred. Once engraved in marble and liturgy, time is no longer negotiable. It is enforced. But there's something stranger. Dionysius' tables synchronize Easter. That was his task. And yet buried in his work is something else. A fragment of text from an earlier chronicle. Unattributed. Out of place. It refers to the Black Twilight, a period of darkness lasting 3 harvests across the Mediterranean basin. He doesn't explain it. He doesn't mark it as metaphor. He copies it, moves on, as if it's common knowledge. But no other document mentions it. Only a few Nordic sagas hint at it, the sun's shame they call it. And Chinese annals from the Tang dynasty describe an invisible star that swallowed the light. Different names. Same phenomenon. Same absence of date. As if time itself was suspended. Historians once mocked the concept of a phantom time. The theory was fringe, mad, even. Proposed in the 1990s by Heribert Illig, it suggested that 297 years of the early Middle Ages were fabricated, inserted, invented by the Church and the Holy Roman Empire to legitimize Charlemagne's reign. It was dismissed. No hard evidence. No smoking gun. And yet, there are inconsistencies no one explains. Charlemagne, arguably one of the most documented rulers of medieval Europe, has no confirmed burial site. No surviving personal relics. No image drawn during his lifetime. Only legends. Descriptions from later centuries. And coinage, yes, but minted decades after his supposed death. As if Charlemagne was a reconstruction. A necessary myth. A keystone in a timeline that needed anchoring. Not because he existed, but because without him, the the narrative crumbles. But the church wasn't alone in shaping time. Islamic calendars, too, underwent reform. The Hijri era begins with the Prophet's migration to Medina. But lunar drift and political recalibrations shifted key observances by decades. In China, the transition between the Sui and Tang dynasties contains records of prolonged darkness. Years with no summer. But no war. No famine. Just absence. As if the world waited. Breath held. Clock paused. What does it mean to invent a year? Or lose one? Would anyone notice? How long would it take? In the 18th century, a Jesuit scholar in Prague recalculates eclipse paths backward. He notices something odd. A solar eclipse recorded in 577 doesn't match the sky. He tries again. Adjust for calendar drift. Still no alignment. Only by subtracting 170 years does the path match the records. He writes to Rome. Receives no answer. His work is shelved. Later, destroyed. In ancient Armenia, there is a chapel carved entirely into volcanic stone. Its entrance aligns to the sunrise on the winter solstice. Or rather, it used to. Now the light falls several days late. Precession accounts for part of it. But not all. The error is too clean, too consistent across distant sites. As if they were all aligned to a different sun, a different sky. The Julian calendar introduced by Caesar slipped slowly out of sync, 11 minutes per year. By the time of the Gregorian reform in 1582, it was off by 10 days. But in some regions, like Ethiopia and parts of Eastern Europe, the reform never took. Different calendars still coexist. Different years, different centuries. Different now. And yet the stars are the same. Or are they? Even sidereal time, star time, has drifted. Some equinoxes no longer fall where they should. Astrologers whisper of veiled constellations. Of the lost house, a 13th sign once observed, now denied. Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, removed not by science, but by papal edict. Erased to simplify the heavens, to make the sky obey the earth. But the earth doesn't forget. Ice cores in Greenland hold trapped memories, layers of sulfuric ash from volcanic winters. And in one, dated to 536, the chemistry shifts. A volcanic signal so vast it turns the world gray, matched, almost perfectly, by another in 540. A twin eruption? Or a misdated repeat? No one agrees. Some believe a single event was split in two to fit a broken chronology. Others claim the opposite, that two events were compressed into one to erase the intervening silence. Either way, the records blur. Time no longer runs straight. A monk in Iceland writes of 3 years of shadow. He calls it skuggasetur, shadow sitting. During this time, he notes, the sun climbed but gave no heat. Birdsong ceased. Herds wandered mad. And at night, stars fell upward. We have his manuscript. But no date. Just a phase of the moon. A dying crescent. Matched to lunar cycles, it corresponds to 3 possible years, none of which align with known eruptions. Unless the eruptions are misdated, unless the years are not real, you begin to understand. History is not what happened. It is what was permitted to be recorded. And those who control the calendar control the memory. In the silence between centuries, what might have taken root? What truths might have bloomed in the dark? The idea is not madness. It is math. A chronology built on corrupted clocks will always lie to itself. And to you? You look again at the map. Trace the lines. The misplaced mountains. The rivers that never were. And you wonder, is this a cartographic error? Or a map of another world? A world forgotten. Or forbidden. A world just slightly out of phase. Like a dream recalled only in fragments. Like a memory that does not belong to you. And yet feels true. You've seen the vault. You may not have known its name. You may not have noticed the hinges, there are none. But the vault exists. Not behind stone or steel. Not sealed by lock or lever. This vault is made of something else entirely. Consensus. Its walls are built from what no one questions. Its key is never made. Because entry is not forbidden. It is unthinkable. Begin in Constantinople. The 9th century. The darkness has passed, so they say. The sun has returned. The plagues have thinned. The cities begin to breathe again. But something has changed. The emperor, Basil I, orders a comprehensive chronicle, a recovery of the years, a stitching back of time. The result is the Chronographia Syntimos, a compressed chronology, edited, filtered, corrected. For whom? For the church? For the court? For the future, the fragments we have left are smooth. Too smooth. The contradictions are gone. The missing years resolved. But if you read the original fragments, the monastic marginalia, the Byzantine treatises, the Syriac chronicles, you'll see it. A pattern, a vanishing, roughly 3 centuries folded in on themselves. Voices cut mid-sentence. Plagues named, but not described. Kings mentioned, but not located. The gap is elegant. Engineered. In the West, the Carolingian Renaissance is underway. Charlemagne's court becomes the beacon of a revived Rome. Scriptoria flourish. New Latin emerges, corrected, purified. Old texts are recopied with uniform grammar. Marginalia are removed. Mistakes are fixed. But sometimes, when parchment is scarce, older texts are scraped and rewritten. Palimpsests. The ghosts of older words survive beneath. And in one such palimpsest, discovered in Corby Abbey, you can make out a different date system. A year numbered not from Christ, but from a catastrophic event. A year 200 after the sky turned black. This system appears nowhere else. It is overwritten with Anno Domini. Not erased entirely, just buried. Silence is rarely blank. More often, it is structured. A frame with nothing inside. An absence built with purpose. Some believe this silence was necessary. After all, how do you preserve faith in a world that forgot the sun? How do you teach continuity when crops fail for years and God seems absent? You erase the rupture. You make the centuries smooth again. You call the old calendar primitive. You call the anomalies metaphor. And the silence becomes scripture. In Ravenna, a church called San Vitale holds a mosaic of Justinian. Gold tesserae, glass eyes, a halo not of divinity, but imperial authority. He stands still in time, never aging, never fading. But the documents that should surround him, tax ledgers, imperial decrees, building records, are thin. Too thin. It's as if the administration existed only in mosaic. A world curated in image, not in paper. A portrait of rule, suspended in light. But the paper crumbles, the silence thickens, and the vault seals tighter. You turn to astronomical records. They should be immune to politics. Stars do not lie. But here too, the vault has done its work. A Syrian observer named Severus of Antioch records a full solar eclipse in what we now call 540. He notes, the light of day fled from the eye, though the hour was noon. But modern calculations find no eclipse over Antioch that year. Others suggest he was describing ash clouds, volcanic fallout. Still others propose he was mistaken. But if he was, why do multiple observers, across different languages, report the same thing? Why is it recorded in China? Why does a Persian chronicle from Ctesiphon use the same phrase? Noon became night? If the darkness was everywhere, why is it nowhere in the official record? Because memory alone is not enough. Memory must be shaped. In the 16th century, the Church assembled its ultimate vault, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of forbidden texts, some for heresy, some for science, but a few for reasons unstated. Among them, a chronicle by an obscure monk named Georgius Syncellus. It contains a version of history that does not align. Its timeline is off by decades. Its references to eclipses and emperors do not fit. No heresy is named. Only confusion. That alone was enough. It is removed from circulation. The vault closes a little tighter. What is erased is not always destroyed. Sometimes it simply becomes unthinkable. Take the Armenian Year of the Silent Sky. The event is known only from a single carved inscription, dated roughly to the 6th century. It marks the consecration of a monastery during a year when the sun ceased to bless the earth. There is no corroborating document, no feast day, no anchor in the wider timeline. But the monastery is real, the carving is real, and the sky once did go silent. Yet no church council mentions it. No ecumenical synod discusses it, because to name it would be to acknowledge it. An acknowledgement is a crack in the vault. Why such precision and erasure? Because time is control. A world shaken by black skies and freezing summers is a world unmoored. A world susceptible to panic, to heresy, to new beliefs. Indeed, the rise of apocalyptic sects accelerates after 536. Revelations is copied and spread. End-time predictions spike. In Britain, monastic annals record dragons in the sky. In Japan, there is mention of black snow. And in Ethiopia, an oral tradition speaks of the Great Forgetting. a time when no one aged and no one was born. That tradition was dismissed by colonial scholars as poetic allegory. But what if it isn't? What if it's memory? Of a pause, a freeze, a vault. There is a church in Spain, San Basilio de Berlanga, carved partially from stone, partially painted with visions of desert beasts. Among them, an elephant, a camel, animals unknown to the region at the time, animals seen only in manuscripts from centuries later. And yet the fresco is dated to before the Reconquest, to a time when such animals should not be known. Either the dating is wrong, or time is, or memory is folding inward, creating space where there was none. A vault that does not just seal, it reorders. In the Vatican, there is a corridor rarely discussed, Archivum Secretum, not secret, exactly, but sovereign. Its contents not available to the public, nor to most scholars. Among the sealed items, calendars, liturgical corrections, anomalous feast days, Lenten calculations that do not fit modern formulas. Some based not on lunar cycles, but something else. A system unknown, a model lost, or hidden. We cannot know, because this corridor, this vault, has no door, only absence. Some claim the missing centuries never existed, that the years between 614 and 911 were inserted to fabricate legitimacy. Others claim the opposite, that the centuries did exist, but their records were destroyed. Both positions contain a terror. Fabrication implies manipulation. Destruction implies loss. But a third possibility is worse, that the centuries happened and were remembered, but not by us. That time diverged, that the records do exist. In another tradition, another system, another vault. There are Coptic texts that place the resurrection in 529. There are Georgian manuscripts that cite the Council of Nicaea as occurring in the 500th year since the swallowing of the sky. There are Ethiopian annals that mark the year 537 as the second Genesis. Not metaphor. System. A recalibration of time. A world rebooted. Not erased. Rewritten. When the volcano erupted, whichever one it was, whether Ilopango or Rabaul or something unknown, its plume did more than darken the sky. It destabilized the future. The famine, the plague, the silence, they became a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the narrative of time was reassembled, rewritten to suit the surviving powers. Smoothed, sanitized, reinforced, and the vault was built. But every vault has hairline fractures. Every silence has an echo. Every absence leaves residue. The erased saint, the wrong eclipse, the dreamlike animal, the map that knows too much. These are not errors. They are keys. You just haven't found the door. Not yet. The vault never opens. It dissolves. Not with a sound, not with a blast, but with a quiet so complete, it feels like the world has stopped breathing. The chronology fails, one thread at a time, and what begins as an anomaly becomes a system of doubt. Begin with a candle, lit in a chapel in Mainz. The year is marked 873. The scribe, whose name does not survive, copies a psalter onto fresh vellum. He notes the day as in the 5th Dition, after the rains of soot. We are not meant to notice that phrase. It is an aside, a memory. But soot does not fall in summer, and no other weather is mentioned. The rest of the text is unremarkable, except that 5 other psalters from the region, copied in the same year, contain the same phrase. It appears, without comment, as if all had simply accepted it, as if soot falling from the sky was part of the calendar. We are taught that time is fixed, that its passage is stable, immune to interference. But what if time is not solid? What if it is sediment, layered, compressed, disturbed? In Greenland's ice cores, something strange appears. A cluster of sulfate spikes, beginning around 536, continuing in pulses through 540, 574, 626, 678, each indicating a volcanic eruption, each matched with tree ring stunting, crop failure, and sometimes famine. But one spike, dated to 773, is massive and silent. No record, no chronicle, no sky darkening, just the chemical scar in the ice, as if the event was forgotten, or erased, or occurred in a time that was later sealed. Some historians now call this the phantom eruption. They debate its origin. Kamchatka? Iceland? Somewhere under the sea? But the silence remains. An event without memory. Its shadow too large for its absence. And in that silence, the certainty of chronology falters. Not because we lack dates, but because dates no longer hold. They slip, slide, drift. Consider the Buddhist calendar. In some traditions, the year of the Buddha's death varies by nearly 300 years. Consider the Hebrew calendar, where the destruction of the first temple, historically dated to 586 BCE, is commemorated in 423 BCE. Consider the Islamic Hijri calendar, which drifts from the Gregorian by 11 days each year. And yet each claims a stable narrative. Each describes events that do not align. Either someone is wrong, or time bends. Back in Europe, one of the last imperial projects to unify time is the Carolingian effort to preserve Roman law. They translate the Lex Salica. They recopy the Theodosian Code. They inscribe legal formulas onto walls and gateposts. But something slips. A series of legal cases refer to crimes that have no context. The theft of 4 cartloads of charcoal from the bishop's night field. There is no record of a night field. No mention in estate maps or boundary texts. And charcoal is not taxed that year. The case appears again in 3 different locations, with minor variations. The field remains unnamed. The time, during the long noon. A phrase that has no place in legal Latin. Unless noon once lasted longer. Unless the sun stayed overhead for days. Unless something interrupted the rotation of the earth, or the record of it. Of course, modern science resists this. It speaks of inertia, of physics, of orbital stability. And yet, in the 8th century Book of Beasts, a monk named Hrabinus Morris draws a diagram of the world, darkened by 7 veils. Each veil corresponds to a sin. But the final veil is not moral. It is cosmological. It reads, Tenebrae naturalis, the darkness of nature. He says this veil fell before time was reckoned rightly. He says we now live in the false dawn. What does he mean? Why does he describe day and night reversing? Why does he draw stars circling backward? Why does he call the sky a wound? The book was never banned, but it was reclassified, placed not with cosmology, but with allegory. And so its warnings were interpreted as metaphor. But Hrabinus wrote plainly. He describes black rain. He describes cold without wind. He describes light without heat. He describes a sky that shuddered, then stopped. Perhaps he was mad. Perhaps he was remembering. At this point, the collapse is no longer hidden. You begin to see it in the little things. Feast days moving inexplicably. Chronicles that skip a king, then resume as if nothing happened. Bones carbon dated to 1 century, buried with coins from another. Children's lullabies that reference the night with 2 noons. What happens when enough of these fragments gather? When the silence becomes a choir? When the archive begins to contradict itself? The modern world keeps time by atomic vibration, by cesium and second counts. But that is not the same as history. Our machines measure intervals, but they cannot tell us what has happened. Only stories do that. And our stories are broken. They have been rewritten, overwritten, edited. Sometimes for order, sometimes for power, and sometimes to forget. Some scholars now speak of chronotaxonomy, the study of time as a layered taxonomy, not a straight line. Others invoke temporal recursion, the idea that certain years loop, reoccur, or overlay. Still others look to the phantom time hypothesis, proposing that entire centuries were inserted to justify imperial continuity. But these are models, attempts. None are certain, because if time itself was fractured, then every attempt to map it must be flawed. We are drawing maps on rippled glass. We are cataloging shadows cast by shifting light. We are measuring history through the lens of survival, not truth. And so you find yourself here, in the final chamber. No locks, no guards, only dust, breath, and the ache of unsaid things. The records are real. The anomalies are real. The smoke, the soot, the silence, real, but they do not add up. Because the equation was rewritten. Because the ledger was burned and recopied. Because the vault is still standing, just beneath the surface. In the way we speak of the past. In the way we refuse to question the calendar. In the way we nod and turn the page. But you've seen too much now. You've felt the dissonance. You've watched time fracture, not loudly, but gently. Like paper under heat. You wonder, if a volcano can freeze an empire. If darkness can reorder chronology. If silence can erase centuries, then what else is wrong? Not just in the archives, but in you. What dreams have you mistaken for history? What absences have you mistaken for peace? What timelines have you inherited without asking why? You light a candle, not for illumination, but for ritual, a small flame, flickering against stone. And in its glow, the dust drifts differently. It does not fall. It hangs, suspended, like time itself, waiting, listening, remembering. The silence returns. But it is not empty. It is dense, like the air before snowfall, like the breath between words. And in that silence, the vault does not close. It waits, not as a door, not as a record, but as a question too large for history, too soft for memory, and too dangerous for certainty. You are no longer in the timeline. You are somewhere beneath it, among the erasures, the edits, the flickering gaps, where light has no origin and shadow no edge. You try to recall what the sky looked like before it dimmed. You try to remember if the snow ever fell without soot. You try to count the years between empires and realize they do not hold. Because the dream has been mistaken for time. Because the time has been mistaken for truth. And the truth has no fixed hour. Only the sound of turning pages. Only the echo of bells no longer rung. Only the candle, and the dust, and the dark. If you believe this story is worth continuing, tap subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Have a good night. Sweet dreams.